Hello class. Today we're going to look at a quick lesson just about the properties of mathematics. I'm just going to go through the properties and explain a few things about them. You just want to have these in the back of your notebook or something just to make sure you're aware of what the properties are because they could help you when you're solving math questions throughout the school year. The first properties we're going to look at are the commutative properties. This one is for addition. It says when the sum of two numbers, the order in which two numbers are added doesn't change their sum. So for example, 5 plus 4 is the same as 4 plus 5. Essentially what this is saying is you can add numbers either direction and it will work. The idea is kind of like a commute back and forth to work. I take the same route, okay, going back and forth. So one's just going one direction and one's going the other. It's important to note that this would not work with subtraction. So if you had 4 minus 5, that's not the same as 5 minus 4. So it works for addition, but not for subtraction. Similarly, the commutative property of multiplication says the order in which you multiply two numbers doesn't change the product. So two numbers, when you multiply them, you switch them, it doesn't matter. But same idea for division. It's not going to work for division, but it does work for multiplication. The next properties to look at are the associative properties. The associative properties, again, it's of addition and then probably of multiplication. The associative property says how do you associate numbers, which essentially says which ones do you add first. So notice I put the parentheses around the 5 and 6 versus the 4 and 5. That's not going to change your answer at all. And then just with algebraic variables, it does the exact same thing. It would not work with subtraction. The order that you place them does matter, and you'd have to go from left to right. So that's something to think about as you're looking at these scenarios. But keep in mind when you're solving these pieces that the addition ideas should work really well, which is why we can kind of add in whatever order we choose to. In a similar fashion, the associative property of multiplication does the same thing, so it doesn't matter the order in which you multiply things. You'll notice when I do multiply, I typically use parentheses. I tend to avoid the x for multiplication because it's going to start being the x for a variable. So that's something to keep in mind as you're looking at the properties as well. But the order that you multiply things doesn't matter, but it doesn't work for division. The identity properties, if you think about identity, you want to keep whatever it is to be the same. So the identity property of addition says if you add 0 to a number, it's itself, which is pretty obvious. If I say I'm going to give you a test on identity property, it's just that same number because that number plus 0 is going to be itself. For multiplication, though, it can't be times 0 because multiplying by 0 would make 0. So for the identity property for multiplication, it's a number multiplied by 1. And I would say this bottom one, 1 times x right here, is probably the most important as you're looking at this situation. So 1 times x equaling x, okay, is going to show up a lot when you get to algebra. Just recognizing that x is 1x is going to be helpful. Now what you'll notice here is the identity property of addition will work with subtraction because the number minus 0 is still itself. And the identity property would work for division. A number divided by 1 will still be itself. So that's different than, say, the associative and commutative properties. The 0 property of multiplication is the easiest one. So 0 times a number is always 0. I made a note over here. Please don't use O. I did a cursive O here. Kind of looks like the Oreos logo now that I look at it. The number 0 and the letter O are very similar. Please don't use O for a variable. Use something else because no one's going to know what you're talking about if you pick O for a variable. They're going to assume that it's a 0. The next property is one that's a little newer. It's called the distributive property. It says to multiply a sum by a number, multiply each part or add-in of the sum by the number outside. So the 4 outside is multiplied by 5 and by 6. I don't know if it's that helpful on this first one because if I was solving this, I would just add 5 and 6 and then multiply by 4. It's more helpful when a variable is involved. So if the number out front, we call this kind of a coefficient sometimes, or the multiplication piece. 4 times a is 4a plus 4 times b is 4b. If this was a minus sign in between, you just put a minus sign in between. But the distributive property is a little bit newer, but you want to make sure that you're able to go through the distributive property and understand the pieces correctly. Okay, that's everything for this video. Like I said, these properties are just used at different times throughout the semester, so you just want to know them. I would say the distributive property is the newest and the one that you want to pay a lot of attention to. Have a good day, everybody.